IoT security is a wicked challenge. What that means is we will probably never fix it for good because it's not absolute. But what we need to do is address the issues that we face. We need to make sure that our security is fit for purpose, that is sufficient for our needs, because context is king. So how do we go about addressing these challenges? I thought I'd go back to 2015 when we started. And when we started, the one word that I summarized the status of IoT security was egregious. And in fact, I'd borrowed from the lexicon of the great Bruce Schneier when he said, we've got to stop creating a security debt. We've got to build that back. We need better security. Everywhere we looked, there were holes. So when we started the foundation, we had we knew that the action was needed was now, and we saw part of our initial objective was to simplify the complex world of IoT security. We needed to democratize it too. We needed to make it consumable. And we also were very mindful that actually as soon as we start fixing things, you know, those adversaries are quite agile beasts, so they just move on, they keep moving. It will never be done. So we needed to evolve with the challenge. And this kind of sets the context where I see IoTSF is today. Our first job, and will always be a job that we maintain, is to drive best practice to the four corners of the globe with the help of our members and the people of this audience. But we've increasingly over the last couple of years been starting to look at what constitutes next practice and how do we contribute to that. So a few words on where we are with best practice. The first thing to say, and I hope you're all aware, that one of the crown jewels of the IoT Security Foundation is something we call the IoT Security Assurance Framework. That's now on revision 3. We published a paper in June earlier this year looking at specific aspects of the IoT security supply chain. Those requirements came into the assurance framework. I was delighted that by the time we got to August, we counted over 10,000 downloads worldwide of that document, something we're very proud of, and any of you who have ever heard me speak will know that I talk about this quite a lot. But the 10,000 downloads of the framework goes into across about a dozen publications we have of over 50,000 downloads. And I think hopefully you'll appreciate the kind of esoteric type audience that we have here. That's some mighty achievement that we have, helping to spread, democratize IoT security. Just recently, in fact, just last week, I was speaking to a security head of a large manufacturing company. How large? Well, they're in 80 countries. They manufacture in more than 50 of those, or assemble in more than 50 of those. And he said, John, look, we've looked at everything that's out there. There's a lot of stuff out there, but the framework is the best we've seen. In fact, it gets better than that, because what he then went on to tell me is that since 2018, they've adopted the framework and they've just distributed it amongst their entire company. So their entire platform, all of their digital security is based off the IoT Security Assurance Framework. The rider on that, of course, the only additional thing that they do is that they provide a pen test, which is good practice, of course. So we're delighted with that. There's a couple of papers that are coming through, which we were hoping to have ready for the conference, but they're not quite ready yet. They are certainly in draft form. So we have some talks and some discussions on those in the proceedings later today. But we've been looking at this thing called the software bill of materials, SBOMs. You know, they've become quite a thing these past couple of years. I think largely driven out of the US and the presidential order. Now, if we talk about SBOMs, software bill of materials, they mean one thing if you're creating enterprise software, but if you're creating products and embedded devices, they mean something different. So we've had a group looking at what software bill of materials means to IoT and IoT security. So if you missed the session, watch out for the announcement because we will be publishing something soon. And on the user side, this is a slightly different audience for us. We started to look at what we might do beyond the developer, the producer community, and we were very interested to start talking about enterprise security. And one group that we've been nurturing for a while, unfortunately a little bit hit by the pandemic, is the Smart Built Environment Group. And that breaks down into 4 sub-communities for us. And so we've got a publication coming out which is looking at IoT security for facilities professionals. Now that's quite a different subject for us because those guys tend to be at the beginning of their security journey. We have to make things even simpler to give them something very practical because they're not security experts, but they are in charge of managing security. So we're trying to make that simple and practical. And again, watch out for that. We have a session later today on that too. So the next practice. The first thing I have to say, I called it back to the future. But it turns out that when it comes to cybersecurity in general, our interest, of course, is IoT security. But when it comes to cybersecurity, we've got some remedial work to do. We've got to fix some of the foundations. Turns out, memory safety and the provenance of pointers is really quite a thing. So if I rewind maybe 50 years or so ago when we first started having, maybe even longer than that, when we first started having electronic computers, they tended to be large machines in a room. We would probably describe them today as air-gapped, although at the time I'm sure air-gapped wasn't a thing because we didn't have connected computers. But then of course you all know the story. They've got smaller. In fact, they're embedded now in pretty much everything that we have and will continue to do so. This is the era of IoT. But there were a couple of things that happened that really started to change the game. And I think the connectivity part, it was a game changer. So we had local networks, and of course, as soon as we went from local networks to public networks, suddenly that changed the calculus because we had this massive attack surface. And of course, everything is becoming software defined as well. So what does that mean? You have an expanding attack surface and you have ultimate hackability, and that's not a good combination. Now, how big is the memory safety issue? Well, we don't know, but we know it's big. I don't think we know, but I think we could probably make some guesses if we looked at... Yeah, well, I'm going to get on to that, John. I think we can make some guesses if we looked at, how many microprocessors we think there are in the world, old and new, and the amount of systems we've got. But a really good piece of evidence we have is some work that's come out of Microsoft probably a couple of years ago now. When they looked at all the vulnerabilities that they were looking at across all their systems, and they estimated that about 70% of their vulnerabilities could be pegged back to this thing called memory safety. So that's something that as an industry we need to get on top of. I'm very proud to say that this is the subject of a UK program called Digital Security by Design. The IoT Security Foundation is a supporter of that program. We're doing our bit to help that along. And I think the goals of that are really quite audacious and ambitious. So we're very pleased to be part of that, and you'll hear a bit more about that in the next session. But we also asked, okay, so next practice, what do we want to do? Can technology save us? How do we make it harder for our adversaries to attack us? And if they do attack us, even if we make it as resistant as we can we become more resilient? Can we make those systems? Can we use technology to be self-healing? And can we achieve this desired state that we've been talking about quite a lot this year, which is continuous assurance? Continuous assurance is a theme that you'll hear throughout the day, I'm sure, I hope. Oh, well, let's not forget, we've got to hit the economic targets too. So we're trying to drive the cost of security to zero. We want to make sure that when we look at globally, we reduce the fragmentation that we see as a characteristic of security. And how do we get it so that within organizations, all of the management and the process overhead is absorbed into our regular operations? We no longer think about it, it's just what we do. And again, when I first started looking at security, it occurred to me that this is an awful lot like quality. Whereas back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s, actually the 80s when I first started doing engineering, we used to talk about quality, and there used to be someone sat at the end of a bench maybe doing some quality inspection, but then we started to adopt this thing called total quality management. And I think, bearing in mind where we are in this new digital world, that's analogous to what we need to do with security. Now, at this point, I'll just mention a couple of projects that we are involved in, which kind of speak to some of those things that I've just talked about. The first one is the many secured project that we have, which is next generation gateway and router security. Also, a new project that we've got just starting called Secure Networking by Design. Now, both of these projects should be of interest to ISPs, router manufacturers, gateway manufacturers. But if we look inside the projects, there are elements there which are more broadly applicable. So where our aspiration for those projects is to go to is to make this being asked for by the market. So if you are many secured, then your security is assured. One thing I do try to do, and I've missed doing it these past couple of years, is to try to give the audience a steer on a good read that I've had recently. The book that I've got up here, I was a little reticent to perhaps share with you, but I decided to go ahead. I was a little reticent because, number one, I read it last Christmas. It was on the bestseller list. And number two, the title. When I first started reading this, the world was was definitely in better shape. Today, we are in a very sensitive geopolitical situation. And so the cover, "This is how they tell me the world ends," is really quite provocative and maybe a little insensitive. But I decided to go with it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is a great read. And if you haven't read it, I recommend you do. This will give you an insight into the murky world of cybersecurity. I personally enjoyed the narrative around bug bounties that is involved in the book. It's not a technical book. It's a journalist that's written it. It's a very easy read. She also goes on to mention at the end about this emerging world. When she scares us about how the world's going to end, then she says, well, that's not the big story. Actually, the bigger story is IoT, because that's really scary. So that's where we come in, right? So if you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend that book. So that's why I included it. That's part of why we're here today. It's at the very top end, hopefully the extreme end of what we might like to achieve. Indeed, IoT Security Foundation tends to look at more of the commodity, the kind of commercial, the industry type security. We don't tend to do the nation state stuff, not at this time anyway. But that's why we're here today, and not just for today. When we started IoTSF, what we really tried to do is to create a home for IoT security. And when I say that, what I don't mean is, us only doing IoT security and we own the world. I mean a focus for it and working with many of our colleagues around the world. So here are my key takeaways. Number one, we've got to continue doing the basics, and we've got to do them bloody well. And that is the best practice stuff that we do. There's no excuse. There's a lot of good material. We publish what I think is, and what people keep telling me, is probably world-class type advice. So there's no excuse. We need to sort out that memory safety issue. There's an initiative in the UK which is being led out by DSBD, which we're very proud of, but that's something else that needs to be fixed. We need to automate. If we want to move at the scale and scope of IoT, we can't rely on manual processes of the past. We've got to reduce the burden of bureaucracy. And it's interesting to me, if I look at places around the world and the schemes that they're coming out with, I just think that's not going in the right direction. That's more of the same of what we're used to, and that will not scale. So we've got to automate. Again, I hope you'll see a lot of this in the discussions today. Now, if that's not enough, let me remind you about the BS that IoTSF offers you. We believe in BS. It's good quality BS, by the way. The first BS that we give you is make sure you build secure. Because if we don't provision security, then it can't be used. So the first thing, if you're a manufacturer, a developer, a producer, you must make sure you include security in your products. The second piece of quality BS that we offer you is the buy secure. So if you're a user, if you buy technology to put your IoT systems together, make sure you specify security in your purchase orders. You have to ask the market for it. Don't just assume it's going to be there. Make sure you ask. From our perspective, this is a much better way of doing things than having regulations. Get the market to ask for it. And of course, once you've got your systems up and running, make sure it be secure. So you've got to maintain that security. You need to maintain that security not just for your sake, because, as it's been said before, in a hyper-connected world, your security is my security, is my neighbour's security. So those are the 3 BSs that we offer you at IoTSF. So that's the second thing I needed to do in this session. The third thing is get us going. And so you'll be delighted here. I'm going to get off the stage in a moment and turn us over proper. So just a couple of things about the timing and logistics. Hopefully I am on time. But after this session, what we're going to do is split you up into, we won't do it, you'll choose yourself, into 3 different tracks. I believe the executive track will be in here. There were 2 other technical tracks, which we have rooms over the back and over to the side here. We'll continue that format after lunch up until the afternoon break. And then in the afternoon, we'll all come back in here and we'll reopen the live stream for the final session, where my good colleague Saab here, who is actually rocking a new look, so you may not recognise him, he's incognito. But he's going to take a hard look at security standards and regulations and frameworks, and with a nod to Monty Python, he's going to say, what have they ever done for us? And he's got some good friends as well, some very experienced CISOs who are going to give us their view about these things too. Then we'll just do a few matters of business at the end of the day. We'll then hopefully have a nice drink, because we'll all have earned it. I know my team will have earned it. Before we go for the dinner. If you are here today and you'd like to stay for the dinner but haven't got a ticket, it's not a problem. Just go and see somebody at the desk. We'll get you to stay for the dinner. Now, just before we get into the session proper, I know this part is a bit hackneyed and sounds like a cliche, but in all sincerity, we couldn't do this without our very valued sponsors. I'm delighted to say that a number of our sponsors have been with us all the way. I won't read out all the names because I'm sure I'll upset somebody in doing so, but these guys enable us to do what we do today. So thank you from me personally.